All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 11 a.m. and we have a very full program for you today. Good morning and welcome to our conservation webinar, Opportunities for Collaboration, a Shared Vision for Wolves in Wisconsin, hosted by Wisconsin's Green Fire. My name is Sarah Wilkins and I'm Science Director for Wisconsin's Green Fire. We're joined today by our Executive Director, Fred Clark, who will be helping the webinar run smoothly and also helping to moderate questions or any technical issues that arise. We're also joined by our WGF co-chair for our wildlife work group, Tom Hoggy. We're very happy that you could join us today. We have a lot of people from all over the country, which is fantastic. We're here for a great conversation with a fantastic panel on wolves and wolf management in Wisconsin. I'll be introducing our esteemed panel very shortly. Before I do that, I'd like to give you a short introduction to Wisconsin's Green Fire. We support the conservation legacy of Wisconsin by promoting science-based management of natural resources. We are one of Wisconsin's strongest voices for science and conservation, and our members work throughout the state on issues including wildlife, fisheries, water resources, forests, farms, and working lands, the science of climate change and how we respond to it, as well as our path to renewable energy. To learn more about how you can join, to donate or collaborate with Wisconsin's Green Fire, we encourage you to visit us at www.wigreenfire.org. You can also find us on Facebook. The format for today's presentation will be short presentations from all of our panelists, followed by a moderated Q&A section. And for those of you who are new to Zoom, just a brief tutorial, some features to help you throughout our conversation. Many of you have a control in the upper right of your screen, and this will allow you to toggle between active speaker and gallery view. So if you want to see all of us at once, you can select the gallery view. If you want to see the speakers speaking only, select that. We also encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can submit your questions anytime during the broadcast, and we will try to get as many questions as we can. There's also a chat function, which is just the single little bubble, and we'd like you to reserve that for technical questions that you have, anything that's going on. Fred Clark will work to address that with you. You should be able to see and hear all of us as panelists, but as presenters, we cannot see or hear you. Please use those Q&A functions to ask your questions. We are recording this program, which will be available on our website for later viewing. So if you have friends who missed it, you can let them know that. So next I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get right to their presentations. So first up, we have Adrian Wydeven. Adrian is a co-chair for the Wildlife Work Group for Wisconsin's Green Fire. He has extensive experience in wildlife management with a special past focus on carnivores and wolves. Adrian worked as a mammal ecologist for Wisconsin DNR from 1990 to 2013, managing programs on endangered and non-game mammals, including gray wolves. He finished his career at Wisconsin DNR in 2015 as a forest wildlife specialist. In his retirement, Adrian remains active in promoting wolf conservation and the sound management of wildlife species. Adrian has a Bachelor's of Science in Biology and Wildlife Management from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and a Master's of Science in Wildlife Ecology from Iowa State University. Following Adrian, we'll have Peter David, and Peter works as a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, also referred to as GLFWC. At the commission, Peter has learned a lot from tribal elders through the sharing of traditional ecological knowledge and has had the opportunity to work with a variety of natural resources, or more than just human beings, in the Ojibwe worldview. This includes waterfowl, wetlands, wild rice, and wolves. Peter earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And last but not least, we have Jodi Habush Sinykin. Jodi serves as legal counsel for Midwest Environmental Advocates. She is a water policy expert and has served as on a variety of high-profile state advisory committees. Jodi also has a strong interest in wildlife conservation issues, and in 2011, she filed suit against the Wisconsin DNR and Natural Resources Board on behalf of a coalition that included the Wisconsin Federated Humane Societies, conservation organizations, hunters, and farmers for violations to state law arising out of a mandated wolf hunt in Wisconsin, specifically centered around the use of dogs for hunting wolves. Jodi holds a Bachelor's of Art from the University of Michigan and a law degree from Harvard Law. So without further ado, we are going to kick off our panel, and Adrian Wydeven is going to start us off. So Adrian, you are up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So my discussion here this morning will be the broad history and of wolf management in Wisconsin, a little bit about their biology and ecology. Go ahead. Next slide. So the animal we're talking about here is a Great Lakes gray wolf, and gray wolves, as many of you know, were once one of the most broadly distributed mammals across the world, across much of North America, much of Eurasia. The gray wolf in the Great Lakes region is a little bit smaller than the western gray wolves, such as those in Yellowstone or Western Canada. An average adult male weighs about 80 pounds, a female about 70 pounds. Still quite a bit larger than eastern wolves of central Ontario or red wolves of North Carolina, where the males weigh about 65 pounds and the females about 55 pounds. And this is the species living within our region. Next slide. Gray wolves live in packs, and the packs are basically family units, traditionally referred to the adult pair as the alpha pair. That's falling out of favor a little bit, that they're basically the breeding pair. In our region, the territories normally average about 30 to 100 square miles. The territories are actively defended through a combination of scent marking, vocalization, especially howling, and active aggression. In places where wolves are not controlled by humans, such as Denali or Yellowstone, the biggest mortality factor on wolves typically are other wolves. Next slide. The seasonal pattern of wolves in our region, spring is a denning period. Typically, wolves are denning from early April until the end of May, early June. The pups are born usually in mid-April. At that point, the pack's activity kind of centers on the den site. The pack is less cohesive. Members hunt by themselves. The adult female is with the pups most of the time. They're typically at a den site from 6 to 10 weeks, averaging about 8 weeks. When the pups are weaned and large enough to no longer be in a den, they're moved to the summer rendezvous sites. That becomes the center of pack activity from early June until the end of September. Any pack can have from 1 to 2 to as many as 9 or 10 rendezvous sites. And from October through the end of March, the pack is in this nomadic mode. They don't occupy specific home sites. They are more cohesive. They travel together more, although they'll split up for short periods of time, and some dispersal may occur at this time. But that's usually the best time to count wolves, because you can see them from the air, or you can count their tracks in the snow. Next slide. Okay. So in our region, we have done research on ecology of wolves. Many people are familiar with some of the trophic cascade research that's been done in Yellowstone. There has been some of that done in our region as well. We're finding that wolves do impact the deer herds and their impact on vegetation. What's been found is that in the interior of wolf pack areas, there's a greater diversity of forbs, wildflowers, shrubs, whereas the edge of wolfpack areas where there's more intense browsing activity by deer, there's more grasses and ferns, is also less browsing on young trees growing up. So we're seeing that wolves are having some impact on the vegetation by their impact on the deer herd. There's suggestions that wolves may be a factor that reduces the spread of chronic wasting disease. This has been mainly demonstrated through modeling efforts, because we haven't really had much chronic wasting disease in areas where we've had healthy wolf packs. So it's not been actually demonstrated amongst wild wolves, but it's been found with other predators that cougars, for instance, are more selective of animals that have chronic wasting disease than the average hunter. Wolves impact the overall distribution of deer herd. They have a culling effect, and and eliminating less suited animals from the population. Wolves have some impact on the presence or distribution of coyotes on the landscape. We're seeing within the region where wolves are occurring that fisher populations have declined. Whether wolves are a major factor there, we're not sure, but wolves are known in many places to impact these mesopredators. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Yeah. This map to the right shows original distribution of gray wolves in gray across the United States, the lower 48 states. Some of the Northeast, it's not well known whether that was really gray wolves or eastern wolves, a smaller species of wolves. And then we see the bright green areas where wolves have recovered in recent years, and the dark green are areas where there's still some potential habitat that wolves are still continuing to spread into. What you can see in the Great Lakes region, most of the suitable areas are occupied. Across Wisconsin, about over a third of the state is broad wolf range. Next slide. Wisconsin, as most places across the United States, has gone through periods of extensive reduction of wolf populations. Wisconsin had a state bounty that lasted from 1865 through 1957. Throughout that period, the population was declining. We may have had thousands of wolves in Wisconsin when European settlers start settling in the early 1800s. By the 1950s, it's down to less than 50, and by 1960, they were most considered extirpated. In 1957, the bounty was ended. Wisconsin was probably the first U.S. state to protect gray wolves, but it was after the population was so low that they were considered extirpated within a year or so. And for about 15 years, were considered an extirpated population. But 1975, 1976 is evidence of wolves returning to the state, and we see a slow growth of the population, and the population really started to take off in the 1990s. Next slide. So I think we got slides out of order here. Can we go to the next slide, Sarah? Yeah, so that slide we'll have to get back to. In 1979, 1980, the state started a formal monitoring program on wolves at Wisconsin DNR. Dick Thiel was the first wolf biologist for Wisconsin, remained that for the first 10 years. And the monitoring consisted of live capture and radio telemetry tracking of wolves. Now that's mostly going to satellite radio collars, but in the past was based on radio collars from the air, monitors from the air. Winter snow track surveys using vehicles, skis, snowmobiles, on foot have been done since 1979, 1980. In 1995, a major volunteer program was established to also use volunteers for doing these winter snow track surveys. Collection of public observations on wolves have been used to help verify the presence of wolves in the landscape. In the summer, house surveys have been used to determine pup production and presence of rendezvous sites. Next slide. So what we see is across the state is a growth of the wolf population, and this is with setting against 4 zones that were established in the 1999 Wolf Management Plan. And initially, most of the wolves were occurring in Zone 1, northern Wisconsin. You can see it spreading across northern Wisconsin. By the mid-1990s, we see wolves starting to establish in central Wisconsin, where we have kind of a pocket or island of forest lands that occur in the central part of the state. And we see the population continue to spread and expand across the state. Next slide. So this map shows the most current wolf distribution in Wisconsin. The circles all represent wolf pack territories. The monitoring programs used in Wisconsin is a territorial mapping system whereby the locations of wolf packs are determined, the extent of their territories, and then the animals are counted within each of those packs. So this represents all the territories. Some of those are occupied by full packs, some of them are just by lone wolves. In general, the packs, the lighter colored packs, the pink packs are packs that have been on the landscape for many years. And what we are counting is about 240 packs occurring across northern and central Wisconsin by 2019. Next slide. So this graphic shows the growth of the wolf population against the various federal and listings for that population. And we see the population, the maroon is when federal listing is as an endangered species. The green was when wolves were downlisted to a threatened species, and the gray was when they were completely delisted in full management, state management authority. We see some reduction in the wolf population in 2013 by design to reduce wolves in areas where there were areas of higher conflict, but that was, the quotas were reduced the next year, and the population again was allowed to rise. So this shows how the population is growing with the background of various sort of federal listings. Next slide. Actually, this is where we go back to the previous slide. If we can jump back up to that one that we had way up in the top of there we go. So one of the things we want to clarify is that population growth shows the growth of the wolf population based on that winter count, which is a count at the bottom end of the annual cycle of wolves. And with wolves, that's when we do most of the counting, is in wintertime when the population is at its lowest point, as well as in the packs are fairly cohesive. But with 200 packs are in the state producing pups and the average of 5 pups per pack, there's a doubling of that wolf population probably in the springtime. But throughout the year, the pups die, some adults die. In the average year, only about 30% of pups survive to the end of their first year. And we lose on the average about 25% of adults every year. So by the winter time, it's back down to a lower level. In 2013, we see the additional reductions with the harvest of the wolf population. But again, that population came up again the next year, even with the wolf harvest. Next slide. Now, back to where we were before. So this table shows the different state and federal listings of Wisconsin wolves, and with the state of Wisconsin, there's both federal listing. Oops, stay at that slide. And the state listing is actually independent of federal listing. Wolves were listed on the state endangered species list in '75, just 1 year after federal listing. This one wants to keep jumping up on us, I guess, huh? But in the state, for the state, mostly it's a progressive move from high levels of protection to reduced protection as the population increases to the point they become a game species. Federally, there's been more of a back and forth. They're federally listed as endangered, went off the list, and then because of lawsuits kept coming back on the list. And not so much that wolves are becoming endangered again, but because of the uses of the Endangered Species Act and the whole delisting process and disagreement in the courts over how that process should work. Now we can move the slide down. So wolf management by the state of Wisconsin was based basically on 2 main plans: a state recovery plan that was developed in the 1980s, and I think was the first U.S. state to develop a state recovery plan. That set a downlisting goal of 80 wolves for 3 or more years for the state of Wisconsin, along with 12 other strategies for recovering the wolf population. Also set a state delisting goal, or I'm sorry, the Wisconsin Wolf Management Plan of '99 set a state delisting goal of 250 wolves outside of Indian reservations, which is just slightly less. For some reason, Sarah, our slides are moving around here. Slightly less than the total count of the state. The reason it was set as Indian reservations is because the state of Wisconsin, as any other U.S. state, does not have management authority on reservation lands, and also set a goal for 350 wolves outside of Indian reservations, and established 14 management strategies for managing the wolf population. So, and there was also slight modification to that plan in 2007, and several attempts between 2009 through 2014 to set up a new plan for the state. But as the state lost management authority, those efforts were tabled. Next slide. Yeah. So one of the things that has changed over time are the committees that were in charge of wolf recovery, wolf management. We had a state recovery team that established management goals for the state in the 1980s. A wolf advisory committee that was mostly technical and agency folks in the 1990s. In the 2000s, a separate wolf science committee and a separate wolf stakeholders committee. And in 2013, 2014, planning effort, there were two committees, or just one committee combined of both agency, science, and outside groups, but more focused on the hunter trappers and farmers and less on wolf advocacy or non-harvest use groups. Next slide. So again, this is the growth of the Wisconsin wolf population against the state management goals, and shows the growth, the overall state population compared to populations outside of Indian reservations. You can see we've grown far below the management goal that was set in the 1999 plan, in part because we underestimated potential carrying capacity, in part because of lack of management authority. But the big question, I guess, as we go into the future is what should be the population goal for a new Wisconsin wolf plan. So we'll go to the next slide. And so this is kind of where we are right now. When wolves are again delisted in the near future, we expect to happen here soon. The federal government started a delisting effort in March of 2019, expected that to be completed by March of 2020, but hasn't completed that process yet. But we expect wolves to again be delisted in our area. And so the question on a new wolf plan for our region would be, do we go back to a management goal of 350 wolves when we have over 900 wolves in Wisconsin? Do we maintain our current population of about 900 to 950 wolves? Or do we set some kind of non-numerical goal to maintain wolf populations that minimize conflicts, optimize ecological benefits, are socially accepted, and allows for reasonable coexistence? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. And this is, represents the various groups that have supported wolf conservation across Wisconsin during the wolf recovery, wolf management period. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for that great talk. I apologize for the slide advance issues, everyone. I think there was some kind of glitch with the automation in the PowerPoint itself. So hopefully that won't happen again. Great talk, Adrian. Now we're gonna switch over to Peter.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, first of all, to Green Fire for the opportunity to serve on the panel today. And I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in as well to listen to this. Appreciate that very much. I'm going to try to present this sort of in the Ojibwe tradition and just give an oral talk, a presentation. So I'm going to be PowerPointless, but I hope the presentation itself isn't pointless. I think many of you have some familiarity with the Ojibwe's cultural relationship with Sinykin, or the wolf. But we do have people in the audience from around the country, so I think it's important for me to touch on this topic, however briefly and inadequately as I'm likely to do this. But in very brief, Sinykin plays a critical role in the Ojibwe creation story. In that telling, the first or original person was placed on the earth only after all the rest of creation had been placed here, because he was completely dependent upon the rest of creation for his survival. However, he eventually came to be rather lonely in spirit, and when he talked to the Creator about that, the Creator responded by introducing him to Sinykin to walk and to talk and to play with. And they became brothers, and they became beings that would share a common fate in this Ojibwe telling. So this telling and other related stories still form the foundation for the Ojibwe's understanding of what our relationship with wolves should be today. And it's also what's really behind the tenet that the Ojibwe hold a sacred responsibility to consider the Sinykin's best interest in the things that they do. I also need to talk briefly about the treaties, especially again for people who may not be familiar with this from other areas. But there are 11 tribes that are members of GLIFIC. They were all co-signatory to specific treaties in the mid-1800s that covered large land areas that later became parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. And areas really interestingly that greatly overlap with where wolves have come to be recovered in the Midwest. And while the usufructuary or the use rights that the tribes reserved under those treaties came largely to be forgotten or ignored over time, they were again eventually recognized and reaffirmed by the United States Supreme Court. And that is a case that is often referred to in brief as the Voigt case. Now, there are thousands of pages of court documents that came out of Voight and extensive stipulations about the management, the biology, or the stewardship of species like deer and walleye. Wolves are scarcely mentioned, and you might wonder why. But the reason really is that the parties in the Voight case were the tribes and the state of Wisconsin, not the federal government. And wolves at the time were not only few in number in Wisconsin, essentially zero when the case started, and just about 17 years later when the final judgment was entered, but they were under federal regulation. And so there wasn't that much that the state could stipulate to. But there was one important stipulation, and that was that GLFWIC would have representation on basically all state wildlife species committees, including those that dealt with wolves. And this is important because while the primary relationship between the state and the tribes must be conducted on a government-to-government level, and I can't stress that enough, a great deal of management or stewardship discussion and data sharing takes place within these special committees. And it's really important that the tribes be at the table. It doesn't replace government-to-government consultation, and it should never be misconstrued to give people the idea that the tribes are just another special interest group or stakeholder group that the state needs to consider. But it is an important second tier of communication at a staff-to-staff level that I think and hope is beneficial to everybody involved. When I first began working at GLFWIC, Voight was still in the courts. And I've always said that one of the biggest parts of my education as a biologist was going to work for the tribes in the middle of litigation, because one of the primary activities in those early years was to discuss the tome of state harvest regulations and try to determine which ones were founded on biology and which ones were actually driven primarily by culture or worldview. And it was the first time in my life, I guess, that I stepped far enough back from my own culture to become aware of how much of what I had sort of traditionally considered biology was really an expression of my own culture's worldview. And that was a worldview that embraced things like sport harvest, fair chase, and human dominion over other beings. And it was enlightening for me, to say the least. I bring you this background today, not to drag you through my life story, but because I think it's really an important lesson in the way we should proceed in wildlife stewardship today, and not just in the realm of wolves. But it turns out that once upon a time, wolf management in the Wisconsin DNR functioned in a way that sort of embraced some of this separation of biological and social concerns. As Adrian introduced in his talk, in the early years of wolf recovery in Wisconsin, most wolf management was directed by this, what was then called the Wolf Advisory Committee, which was people really by biologists who were applying the best available science. Of course, you know, few parts of wildlife management are more influenced by social concerns than things dealing with the wolf. And so when wolf numbers in the state finally grew, a separate wolf stakeholders committee was created. And the name of that original group was changed to the Wolf Science Committee. This large stakeholder group was diverse, it was balanced, and it was given the opportunity to express its concerns. And many times efforts were made to accommodate those concerns. The 350 number that's in the existing Wisconsin Wolf Management Plan is one example of that. That number was not the original recommendation of the Science Committee. Now, these separate committees, I think, were a very good way of doing business. And in my humble opinion, it's really the only way it should be done for areas where state and tribal rights overlap, because it clearly separates biological and social concerns. And that's actually a very critical element of the Voight decision. However, under the previous administration, these two committees were disbanded and a new one was created. Although the old name of the Wolf Advisory Committee was sort of recycled, this new committee didn't resemble the old one by that name very much, because a large part of the membership was now made up of stakeholder groups. But it turns out that almost all of those stakeholder groups are groups that are generally unsupportive or antagonistic towards wolves. Now, it's not my place to tell the state how to listen to its constituents or which organization should have its ear. But I have served in my professional capacity as sort of a liaison between the tribes and Wisconsin DNR under several different administrations. And I have done some of the same in Minnesota. And I have 3+ decades of experience, I guess, in seeing what works and what doesn't. Now, I haven't shared with you yet what our member tribes' primary positions towards wolf stewardship are. And if I had to sort of limit it to the top 3 points, I think they'd be these. One is allow wolves to determine their own population level on the landscape. There's no legitimate need to suppress a population that's remarkably low, even when it's at carrying capacity. The second thing is to not allow recreational harvest, okay? Until we can at least get to that point in a post-delisted world, the tribes would want the state to close not only the reservations to harvest by state licensees, but roughly a 6-mile buffer area around them so that they can protect wolves that live primarily on the reservation, but occasionally venture off. And most Wisconsin reservations are too small to come close to containing an entire wolf pack. The third point is strong support for an effective livestock depredation program. And the tribes have accepted the judicial application of lethal depredation while favoring non-lethal control where that can be effectively applied. Now, I have been known to say that I thought there may be no area where state and tribes differ more on wildlife stewardship than in the arena of wolves. But recently, I think I've really been coming to rethink that statement. Because while most of the stakeholder groups that are involved in the advisory committee probably considered those positions of the tribes that I just stated as being sort of extreme, it turns out to the public, that's really not the case. And if you want support for that statement, excuse me, I suggest you really please take a look at the most recent wolf attitude surveys that are available for Wisconsin and for Minnesota. I don't have time today to go into the details of those surveys, but the Wisconsin survey was conducted 6 years ago and found that statewide, among people with an opinion, about 60% of the population, excuse me, about 60% of the population wanted about the same or more wolves than existed in the state at that time. The Minnesota survey was conducted just this year, and I would like to think after 6 more years of public education efforts to shine some light on the historic myths that typically haunt wolves, and found that an amazing 86% of state residents wanted as many or more wolves in that state than currently existed. And that's a state that has a population that currently supports about 2.5 times as many wolves as Wisconsin. I think those kind of attitude surveys indicate that there was a serious flaw in the composition of the Wisconsin Advisory Committee. It didn't reflect the desires of the public as a whole. I think that's unfair to the public, and I think it's unfair to the tribes as well, because I would argue, and this is a personal opinion, but I would argue that the tribes, well, the state is not likely to have a great relationship or appropriate relationship dealing with the tribes until it has an appropriate relationship dealing with its own constituents. Now, the Minnesota Wolf Attitude Survey I just mentioned was conducted in order to inform the update of the Minnesota Wolf Management Plan, which is currently underway. I think that survey itself was a critical step to drafting a plan that addresses broad public interests. The second step is how they constructed the committees that will shepherd that plan's development, and that was committees with an S. Minnesota created a 20-member advisory committee and populated it with very diverse interests, a really broad and balanced group, and you can go onto their website and see who is actually sitting on that committee. Importantly, I think, too, is that there are a number of people on that committee who are actually unaffiliated with organizations. And I think my experience has been that that's going to greatly facilitate the success of that group. Unaffiliated individuals are often more moderate, more flexible, and they're more willing to come towards compromise than people who are embedded in their agency's positions. Minnesota DNR also convened a technical work group what might be called a science committee to review the wolf plan components, provide assessment and evaluation of the plan, make recommendations on things like population monitoring, research, and other aspects of stewardship. So it's sort of like Back to the Future over there. What would work? Tribes like to see going forward? Well, certainly the state needs to really embrace this government-to-government relationship with the tribes. And I would suggest that that would include attempting, in a positive and sort of proactive way, the development of a management/stewardship stipulation for wolves, as was done for a number of other species in the white case. I would also encourage the state to return to maintaining these separate science and stakeholder committees and populating the stakeholder committee with a full range of interests, including some of these non-affiliated individuals. You know, I want to close by saying we've really come a long ways in my lifetime in Wisconsin. The last time Albany was paid to kill a wolf in Wisconsin was just a few years before I was born. Wolves have returned to the state, and although they may number only about a third of what they did when only Native Americans populated this land, their recovery is still ecologically and culturally significant, especially to a people who understand that their fate is tied to that of Mayangans. Maybe most incredibly of all, the false narratives about wolves that have been perpetuated for centuries are finally being replaced, I think, with a truer understanding. And most people in both the tribal and non-tribal communities now hold positive attitudes towards wolves. I think there's a great opportunity right now in Wisconsin and the other states in the Midwest to work with the tribes and to become national and even global leaders in Mayangan stewardship. Miigwech, thank you.
Miigwech, thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. And thank you for sharing your vision. All right, we are going to finish out our panel this morning with Jodi Habush Sinykin. And I'm going to advance the slide, and Jodi, you can start whenever you're ready.
Very good. Thank you. I too feel really honored to be part of this extraordinary panel and receive this invitation from Greenfire to present on my longstanding legal involvement in this area, as well as to move the conversation forward with regard to a Wisconsin wolf management plan. The biological information that Adrian shared and the cultural and treaty commitment imperatives that Peter really touched on lays right into where I will be going in terms of my talk. I will be addressing somewhat the stickier aspect of how we get there. What is the process by which we can reach a shared vision? How can we move our state, our thinking towards an updated wolf management plan? As you heard from both Peter and Adrian, we are operating under a 20-year-old wildlife plan for wolves. Constructed in 1999, it was well reached with great science for the times and committee and consensus opportunities. However, there has been so much progress, not just in terms of biological science, but in social science, in terms of understanding the public's tolerance for wolves and interest in trying to preserve wildlife in Wisconsin. So I want to walk us through this roadmap to a shared vision, and then I'm looking forward to your question and answer session as well. Just as Wisconsin protects our incredible public trust water resources for all of us to enjoy now and into the future, our state holds that same responsibility to protect our wildlife into the future. And our state's wildlife managers, our Department of Natural Resources, they're not free to follow their own beliefs or to listen to just a few, limited few interest folks in the absence of science. Rather, they are bound to protect the public trust for current and future generations. And in order to hold wildlife managers accountable, what is needed is an open and transparent process so everyone understands how and on what basis wildlife decisions, including those relating to wolves, are being reached. And I really appreciated Peter walking through that process in terms of what he has observed over his decades involved in this, because it's only by understanding the process and what science is being relied upon and what voices are being listened to can we understand and assess the value of the outcome. So I'm just going to start on this particular slide. I really see Wisconsin wolf policy as a litmus test. It's really important for all of us to appreciate that there's many species and habitats encompassed under Wisconsin wildlife policies and under the DNR's public trust responsibilities. But wolf policy happens to be one of those areas where there's extreme thoughts on either side and a lot of emotion, and there has been difficulty in the past, in recent past, trying to reach a place where we are bound to best science and in concert with where our public is at. So in terms of a roadmap to a shared vision, we recommend, and we really put to Wisconsin's DNR, that they have everything to gain by pursuing high scientific standards and representative public involvement, because their management is sure to be tested. There's going to be a close eye on how they perceive. So a number of questions that certainly come to mind is, will Wisconsin's DNR honor the Evers administration's avowed commitment to science? Will the DNR engage a diverse and representative range of wildlife policy decisions? Or will DNR continue the past administration's effort to limit the advisory committee participation to hunting organizations? And you heard Peter speak to that as well. And finally, will DNR's approach towards Wisconsin's wildlife species, including wolves, stay true to the state's public trust obligations for future and current generations of Wisconsin? Next, thanks. In preparing for this presentation today, I really appreciated the opportunity to dig into leading voices in conservation, which are working on the same puzzle, the same working through how to accomplish this process, these outcomes that we are looking for. And two in particular that really helped inform our understanding of this is, here you can see the 2019 report by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. It's AFWA, is that changes are needed to keep wildlife agencies relevant to the public. It looks like that, and we're well able after this to provide the website to it. But I really recommend that folks take a look at it, especially those involved with wildlife management decision-making, because it holds a lot of great ideas and describes the process, the expansive, encompassing, diverse process by which they reach their recommendations. Also, interestingly, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service prepares surveys every 5 years. And the one that we have to work with is back in 2016, and they prepare a survey of the fishing, hunting, and wildlife associated recreation. They look at numbers, and they also look at dollars and cents in terms of those activities. It looks like this. And again, I recommend that folks take a look at it to see who's using our wildlife resources in terms of enjoyment. This is a trend that I assume has only progressed since 2016, but there was back then around 11 million hunters who were surveyed or represented our percentage of our population, the American population, compared to 4 or 5 times that many who enjoyed wildlife in terms of photography, viewing, hiking, and ecotourism. So that's just an interesting trend. And I too looked at Minnesota's Wolf Advisory Committee selection, which, as Peter described, represents a diverse array of perspectives. What's coming clear from not just these documents, but other reports, academic and otherwise, that I looked at, is that there's 2 common aspirations. One is the importance of growing a constituent base in wildlife conservation governance. And the second is to increase recognition of non-consumptive users of wildlife, which is another way to say of non-lethal or non-hunter folks who enjoy wildlife in that respect. Thank you. Next. Sarah, we can go to the next slide. Thanks. As I mentioned, this AFWA Wildlife Relevancy Roadmap is just dense with great ideas for us to be working towards. One is that agency leadership and governing bodies need to demonstrate commitment to being more inclusive of diverse perspectives and interest in fish, wildlife, their habitats, and outdoor recreation activities. And that an agency's public trust responsibility extends to all members of current and future generations. Something that I really liked, it was a quote that was used in their conclusion of this close to 100-page document. And it was a quote that heralded back to 1903, which strangely has great relevance today. It states, "You can't do today's job with yesterday's methods and be in business tomorrow." Not bad advice for those of us who work in the business of fish and wildlife conservation. And I just think that it's something I was eager to share on this forum as well. Thank you, Sarah. The next one. What Wisconsin wolf management should avoid is a couple of key points. It's something that should be a no-no in terms of where we head in the coming months or years. One is a further delay in updating our 20-year-old wolf management plan. We've had a number of years since wolves have been again relisted or returned to federal control. For the last 5 years, we've had the opportunity as a state to move forward to updating the wolf management plan again with the current science that Adrian and the current social science data that Peter also referred to. It's important that we do so, I would argue, before we again have wolves delisted and returned to Wisconsin's state protection and management, because then there will be pressure. There'll be a lot of things and pressure and interest blurring that and where we can go with it. Whereas now we have that time before they are again delisted. We can get our ducks in order in terms of all the matters we talked about for population, with regard to conservation, in terms of how their any harvest zones will be established and the like. The time is now, not when there is so much pressure. The second really is, again, creating a wolf advisory committee that is weighted towards game management interests is something to avoid. There's different ways of looking at advisory committees. There's game management, which are primarily geared towards hunters, how to manage a species that would promote hunting license opportunities, for example, or create opportunities for maximal hunting. The other approach, of course, is conservation management. Those take into account many of the factors that Adrian talked about, like trophic cascade and the value of apex predators like wolves, and forest health, which is so important in today's times with climate change affecting our forests, and also just requiring as the protection for as many old growth forests as possible. We need that perspective. So a future advisory committee will not be weighted towards the game management, but looking at a far greater global vision. And finally, Wisconsin wolf management should avoid the blurring of science as social, as Peter so well spoke to. The reliance, for example, on an arbitrary population goal. We all were here and saw how the goal or the threshold of 350 wolves from 1999's plan was latched onto. And actually, in the 3 years that Wisconsin had wolf harvest until they stopped in 2000 and at the end of 2014, they were driving towards that 350 number in terms of the quotas for the harvest and the determination of where the harvest could take place. So Adrian had a slide up that talked about a science-based assessment of looking at carrying capacity of our landscape and social science data, including the 2016 or the 2014 survey of Wisconsin residents. And the reason I have this image of it's Groundhog Day all over again is because by ignoring any of the need for this progress, by going that same route that we did the last time wolves were delisted and returned to Wisconsin's management, it's going to happen all over again. If we don't correct, fix, and improve the process, we're going to have the same public outcry. We're going to have the science subordinated to special interests, and we will have the public trust undermined to the detriment, not just of our current generations, but to the future. And I would argue that is a situation we all wish to avoid, and there's a bit of imminence to what we need and what we're asking for. Thank you, Sarah. I can go to the next. What's important for folks to understand is the legal constraints that exist at the present time for wolf management in Wisconsin. In 2002, a Wisconsin State Law, Act 169, was enacted, which mandates, doesn't just allow in terms of the DNR's discretion, but mandates a recreational hunt and trapping season for wolves once wolves are returned to state management. And this Act 169 also authorizes the use of dogs to hunt wolves and the training of dogs to hunt wolves, which are hunting practices allowed nowhere else in the United States and not elsewhere in the civilized world either. But even with the constraint of this state statute, which of course can be, there can be amendments to it or it can be removed, that there are improved outcomes possible with an inclusive and science-based process. First of all, DNR policies and regulations can provide science-based and culturally sensitive safeguards to the statutory imperatives described. Core wolf habitat can be designated based on the science to inform DNR decisions making regarding harvest quotas in zones. In other words, even if a harvest is mandated, where it takes place and the actual numbers can take into account cultural and scientific and other considerations. And finally, there can be the educational programs that can really be put out there that can explain wolves' invaluable contributions to forest health and deer health, including chronic wasting disease, the efficacy of animal husbandry and predator management practices, and keeping livestock depredation in perspective according to the facts that we know. And next. Sarah, to the last slide is great, thanks. So what we're doing is calling on Wisconsin to initiate a science-based and inclusive planning process to update Wisconsin's wolf management, and it will be two steps. One is the reestablishment of a wolf science committee consistent with the Wisconsin idea to generate wildlife recommendations per best available science. And number two is the reestablishment of a representative wolf advisory committee comprised of diverse stakeholders to consider the science committee's recommendations through a social, cultural, and economic lens. So thank you all for this opportunity to share thoughts on the process and how we can get there in our next wolf management plan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jodi, for outlining that roadmap and for wrapping up our panel so eloquently. I'm going to pass the controls over to Fred Clark, who has been moderating and tracking the questions that have been coming in, and he'll take it from there.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Jodi and Peter and Adrian for wonderful and informative presentations. We've asked the three of our panelists to provide their own unique points of view based on their experience, and I think they have all done that today in a really effective way. So we've got a large number of questions
We certainly won't get through all of, but many of you submitted questions ahead of the program today when you registered, and thank you for those of you who took time to do that. And we've also got a large number of questions in the queue. So without further ado, we're going to invite any of our panelists to respond to the questions as they see fit. Number one is, I think Adrian, maybe this will go to you first. Back to some of your earlier points about how we monitor and estimate the wolf population. Is the population estimate derived from a model at all, or is it solely based on the winter survey and the pup surveys that you described? And in your estimate, based on the methods that we're using, how accurate or how variable can we expect those population estimates to be from year to year?
Yeah, well, currently it's based on minimum counts and based on track observations in the wintertime, radio collar packs that are observed from the air, public observations that can be verified. But it represents a minimum count of the wolf population, which is probably very suitable when you have very few wolves in the landscape. As the population increases in numbers, it becomes more challenging. And there are current efforts underway to do a patch occupancy modeling system. And that has been done experimentally in Wisconsin the last 3-4 years. We don't have a population count for 2020 yet, either a minimum count or patch occupancy modeling count, but that is the plan for the Wisconsin DNR. The benefits of this other method is that it will give you some kind of a confidence interval. That one of the problems with minimum counts is they don't allow you to estimate confidence intervals. But I'm guessing the confidence intervals will be fairly broad. The experimental use of patch occupancy modeling the last couple of years has shown that generally when that estimate is made, the minimum count ends up being near the lower end of a normal 95% confidence interval. So that's kind of what you expect a minimum count to do, that it gives you a bare minimum number of the animals that can be detected, verified in the field, recognizing you're always going to miss a few animals. And the estimation process that will use modeling that will be used in the future will give you a broader confidence interval. Plans will be to continue to do minimum counts and a mixture of minimum counts and population estimations in the future.
Thank you. Peter or Jodi, any other comments on that question?
I might comment briefly. I would just say we use this term minimum count. This is close to a census effort. And it's interesting to me that this method has gotten attacked sometimes, because really, in a lot of ways, the Wisconsin approach to counting wolves has kind of been considered the gold standard. It is interesting to note that the 3 states in the Midwest all use little different methods in coming up with their estimated wolf population. But it's always been interesting to me, too, that all 3 of those numbers that they generate make a lot of sense relative to each other. And they suggest that really kind of provides credence to each of the numbers that's being conducted. And I would just say this move towards occupancy modeling isn't really so much an effort to get a better count as to find really a more reasonable or more affordable way to try to come up with an adequate count, because the census methodology gets expensive as the wolf population grows. But there will probably be wide confidence intervals around it, and that's something that people are going to have to take into account when they're thinking about population management.
Well, thank you. I think the next question follows on this, and that's, can you talk more about what the population management goal, what that number should mean for us? Does it represent a minimum population? Does it represent a maximum? How should, if that number is used in a management plan, how does that inform the work of the department and the work of tribes and others in defining a wolf management program?
Yeah, the 350 management goal that grew out of the 1999 plan was intended to be a goal to try a number to achieve and maintain a population near that level, but it was never intended to be a cap or a ceiling on the wolf population that we're going to hold the wolf population at this number. And it was intended to be a temporary number that was going to be reviewed every 5 to 10 years to see whether the number was still suitable based on the best available science. The number 350 was somewhat of a political compromise that as Peter had mentioned, the wolf committee itself had recommended managing for a population between 300 to 500 wolves, and that through various efforts was reduced to a 350 management goal, and that was what was finalized in the final plan. But it's a level that was based on assumptions that carrying capacity was about 500 wolves for Wisconsin in the 1990s, and more recent estimates suggest the carrying capacity for the state may be well over 1,200. So the goal was based on the best available science at the time in 1990s, as well as some political compromises.
The one thing I would add too is this idea of a science-based assessment really is the most productive path forward, rather than trying to gear it towards either game management interests or otherwise. And as Adrian just mentioned, it's so much based on the science, peer-reviewed science for carrying capacity, even as what's been demonstrated in recent years, and of course the social science data. So we do have this public attitude survey from August of 2014, and it is available on the DNR's website. But that's already 6 years ago. And as we are seeing in our country, attitudes change, and ideas are flourishing at, it seems like, a accelerated rate. And I would imagine that also pertains to wildlife management concerns. So we do need to have a better understanding of the public's tolerance within wolf range for populations of wolves in coexistence, and also to understand the science. And maybe Peter, you can speak to this, given what you shared about the views of the tribes regarding wolves self-regulating their populations, is the science of that wolves will, if left alone, manage and reach a plateau of their population themselves, and that hunting oftentimes disrupts the natural pack order, their ability to be productive, and to maintain that population level. So that could be an interesting entry into the science of wolves self-regulating abilities in that regard.
Yeah, and I think there was a comment or two maybe in the comments box, but I would just reiterate, you know, this thought that 350 number was a compromise. It created at a time when we only had about 200 wolves in the state. And again, as Adrian mentioned, we thought carrying capacity was maybe in the ballpark of 500. And what we know now, what we've learned in the last 20 years teaches us that number is considerably poorer as a goal than we thought. We also do know that wolves are really good at regulating themselves and have very low numbers. Their numbers have plateaued in Minnesota. It looks like they're plateauing here in Wisconsin and in Michigan as well. And interesting that in both of those two states, and I think in parts of Wisconsin, when we look at other species, this whole kind of heavy emphasis on numbers is being moved away from. The other two states do not have a target population. That's not what 350 was in Wisconsin anyway, even though it's been interpreted that way. But there's sort of more specific goals that are developed. So if your goal, for example, is to have an effective depredation program, then your goal is to meet those goals and not a specific number of wolves. And so as long as you have an effective program in place, then maybe it doesn't matter whether you have 500 wolves or 700 wolves. So you set up these other thresholds and criteria to meet that take you away from this focus on numerics.
Great, thank you. Really thoughtful responses. A question was raised about chronic wasting disease. And as we continue to see the spread of chronic wasting disease into wolf territories, do we have any understanding or prediction about the role that wolves may play in either limiting or affecting the spread of CWD?
Well, the evidence on wolf impact and chronic wasting disease probably are three different areas. One is that there was some modeling done about 9-10 years ago that suggested, based on the kind of behaviors wolves display, that they could potentially impact the spread, reduce the spread of a disease such as chronic wasting disease, and perhaps even prevent it from establishing. A second line of evidence are cougar research in Colorado shows that cougars are 3 to 5 times as likely to kill deer that have chronic wasting disease than the average hunter. And cougars are ambush predators. Unlike coursing predators, there's actually less of a testing process, so they're probably less selective even than wolves would be. A third line of evidence are that where we have healthy wolf packs across Wisconsin, we have almost no evidence of chronic wasting disease establishing in the wild. So while we've not been able to test wolves in areas of chronic wasting disease, in part because it doesn't seem to happen there, the evidence seems to suggest that it's unlikely that it will establish in those areas, but we shouldn't take it for granted that it never will occur there, and we still need to be careful to carefully monitor for chronic wasting disease throughout the state, so that it can be dealt with specifically if it does occur. But there's evidence that wolves may be an important factor.
And I would just emphasize Adrian's comment about, healthy wolf packs. We need more research in this realm, but I think there's some reason to think that wolves are sort of the white blood cells out there, helping to maintain the health of the deer herd. And to that degree, the number of them you have is important. Wisconsin is going to be more protected against chronic wasting disease with a higher population of wolves than with a lower one. It's pretty simple math, I think, at that point.
And this just complements what was just said, but when a DNR or wildlife team is very beholden to specific numbers, that really does drive, again, if there were to be harvest again, the amount. At the end of the last harvest, there was in 2014, they were looking at the wolf pack number, the average was 2.5 wolves. And it would be up to the scientists to be able to argue whether or not an average size of 2.5 wolves is a functioning body that can protect that wolf pack from not having to go to depredation. Are they still able to hunt deer and other natural prey? So it's the human disruption that often appears to be more of a problem or a challenge when we're talking about chronic wasting disease, of course, perhaps wolf mortality, and again, re-emphasizing forest health. Wolves, just by the scientists tell us, they keep the deer moving. They keep them not just in one part of forest and allow for a healthier, more diverse forest system. So there's a lot of interesting videos and readings on that positive aspect of wolves as well on the landscape.
Thank you. Peter, you touched on the issue of wolf depredation a bit in your talk, but I think as a couple of questioners have pointed out, is the wolf population has reached a higher level than we've seen in the past. The extent of wolf-human interactions, the extent of wolf depredations of dogs and of livestock have increased. What, in your opinion, for any of you, needs to be in place in order to manage those conflicts and help minimize the sort of social lack of acceptance for wolves on the landscape?
So I'll take a stab at starting this discussion off. I'd say, first of all, that livestock depredations are a problem for individual livestock growers. They're not much of a problem for the livestock industry as a whole. The number of livestock that are verified killed or injured by wolves in Wisconsin in a year is comparable to the number that go to slaughter about every 30 minutes, 365 days of the year. So yet, if you're an individual losing 1 or 2 or 3 calves, that's significant to you. Hunting is often brought up as a tool to maybe help address this. The fact is that that's a very ineffective tool. If I'm losing a calf in the spring, hunting season in the fall, that may or may not have any impact on the wolves that are causing me problems, just isn't a very effective technique. So what you need is really, Wisconsin has got a strong program in place. When people have a suspected depredation, preserve the evidence, get the federal agents there quickly to make a confirmation of what the actual cause of the loss is, and then undertake appropriate steps quickly to address that problem when and where it's occurring. And those are the kinds of things that can be effective.
There, I don't know if you could pull up, there was a slide I had of the numbers of farms and the depredations by year. If you can pull that up.
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Yep, so I'll start talking while you're doing that. But the point I'd like to make is that there's often an assumption made that the levels of depredation correspond exactly with the population, that as the population goes up, the depredations goes up, population goes down, the depredations go down. What I want to demonstrate here is that if you look at this, the numbers of farms with wolf depredations, it peaks in 2010, while our wolf population was still growing through 2012. So, and then between 2010, 2014, there's over 50% reduction in numbers of farms with depredations. But this is a time period wolves were actively being managed. There was an active depredation control program that allowed lethal controls on problem wolves by government trappers, as well as farmers. There was a hunting season in place as well. And we see a constant reduction of the numbers of farms with depredations, much more drastically than the reduction in the wolf population. The wolf population from the start of 2012, when they were delisted, was about 815. When they were relisted again, it was about 746. So an 8% reduction in the wolf population resulted in over 50% reduction in the numbers of farms with depredation, suggesting that a more flexible management did allow for drastic reductions, showing that you can reduce levels of depredation without having to drastically reduce the numbers of wolves on the landscape.
Great, thanks, Adrian.
And one thing I would add, Fred, is to this discussion point is, as Peter mentioned, the number of actual livestock that are killed is a very small percentage of livestock lost due to fire or illness or cold, other type matters. There have been certain studies that have suggested 1% are attributable to all predator kills, which would include coyote and bear and wolves. So it's a small amount. Something that reveals that, which is interesting, is what just came out for the state of Michigan just last week relating to the Upper Peninsula, where there are 900 livestock operations. Only 6 out of them, according to the Michigan records that from their government, their version of our DNR and DATCAP, only 6 of the approximately 900 operations, or 0.006%, experienced a conflict with wolves in 2019. So it's very small numbers. What much of the science, and I'd be interested in hearing more on the science, has shown that beyond dealing with particular problem wolves, the animal husbandry techniques of the actual livestock operators, such as fencing, guard dogs, and flagging, and the like, or in combination, have proven far more effective necessarily than certainly a recreational hunting season, which, as Peter described, is many months later and might not even be involving the particular problem wolves or those who are not honoring the constraints of the fencing and the like. So it's just something more to think about.
Thank you, Jodi. A couple of people have asked questions about the role of, you all have described the sort of stakeholder process and some of what has gone into our current wolf management system and presumably what could go into a future system. What is the role of the Conservation Congress in informing the wolf management at the state level?
I'll jump in initially. So in Wisconsin, the Conservation Congress does have statutory role as advising the DNR on all wildlife management, fisheries management issues. And throughout our wolf planning process, we've always had seats on any advisory committee, that there was always a seat, 1 or 2 seats for members of the Conservation Congress. So they've played roles. They've helped facilitate meetings and hearings on wolf management. So yeah, they have been a part of the wolf management process from the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Another question directed to you, Jodi. Peter mentioned the word that we don't often, laymen don't often hear, or lay people don't often hear, and that's usufructuary rights. Peter, can you or Jodi speak just a bit more about what usufructuary rights are and whether those rights have been tested in court, or what particular rights are understood to be covered under that concept?
Peter, do you want to begin under the Voight agreements? It was really under that agreement that defined those and how they have been used or tried to be used as it pertained to the wolf harvest for those 3 seasons. That is more controversial, but maybe you could lay the groundwork and I could add in from there.
Well, speaking as a non-lawyer, I'll say, I mean, my understanding is that it's sort of a elegant way of saying use right. And that being said, it's not necessarily very specifically defined by the courts. And there is some wiggle room, I think, in how you interpret what that means. There are those, I think, who would say that you only use things, for example, a wildlife species, maybe by harvesting it. The tribes, I think, would disagree with that statement very much. You might use a maple tree by cutting it down and converting it to firewood, but you might also use it for sap or to enjoy its shade. And when it comes to wolves, you might use them by taking advantage of the ecological benefits they provide, like helping keep the deer herd healthy. So that's the tribe's perspective, I think, and that they're using wolves even though they have no interest in harvesting their brother. But you could probably put a more elegant legal description on all of this, Jodi.
No, I think that's really is the understanding. There was quite a bit of controversy and legal analysis of the usufructuary rights under Voight agreement during the 3 mandated harvests in Wisconsin, and how the tribes really tried to convey that was that they would take their allotment under the agreement, but not use them for hunting purposes. As you stated, the use that they argued was that to keep them alive as living sentient beings, culture in alignment with their cultural beliefs and otherwise. And the game that was played then, of course, was for the next year and next 2 years, the harvest quotas were reconfigured with the foreknowledge that the tribes would not be actually using their rights under the treaty for hunting and trapping purposes. And that's really how it boiled out. I think it's still very much an issue open to legal interpretation or legal resolution. It is an interesting one and a good question.
Thanks. Well, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to ask each of you to just offer your thoughts about what you believe needs to happen going forward. So part of the reason that we're holding this program is because we understand it to be very likely that wolves will be delisted again sometime soon. And then there will be ball back in the court of the state of Wisconsin to determine how to manage the wolf population in context with our tribal partners and others. I want to ask each of the 3 of you to just take a minute and lay out what you think the most important elements of a robust, sustainable process are for developing a wolf management plan in Wisconsin. And Jodi, if you'll let me, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that much of my presentation really did lay out that roadmap. You heard my speaking to the importance of a science-based aspect, really science that is vetted, that is peer-reviewed, that allows that to move forward. Because as we all know, for other matters not related to wolves, not everyone trusts science or necessarily believes it applies to things that they have beliefs about. So to have the best available science available to our wolf management plan, that helps with respect to the public's buy-in and support for those recommendations. The second important pillar, of course, is this inclusive and representative broad array of interests or perspectives. And Peter even pointed to Minnesota's having folks who are not aligned or affiliated with any particular organization, that they are concerned Wisconsin citizens, end of story. And to have those perspectives, because again, what science is relied upon and prioritized will very much depend upon whether or not Wisconsin is interested in a management plan geared towards game management, stuck on this mandated harvest for wolves, which might not be supported by either science or public tolerance or acceptance as we move ahead, especially given what we all know of this mass extinction going on in the world and concerns related to forests and habitat, biodiversity, and the like. Attitudes will change, and we need to allow for that flexibility in our planning. So with those two key components, I believe that Wisconsin can operate productively, even with the legal constraints that currently exist, which might, of course, change in the years to come as well. And then there'd be even more opportunity to go with the science and with public attitudes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. Peter?
You know, everything Jodi said, I think you'd see the tribes agree with. You know, the only real addition to that is that the tribes are not stakeholder groups, and it is critically important that the state really embrace in a positive way the government-to-government consultation that's required. Those are the big litmus tests that are out there. And I think that really covers the primary things. If you have an open process, I will add just one little caveat about, you know, that again, while the tribes are not stakeholders, we do appreciate the opportunity to be involved and interact with those groups. It's beneficial for us to learn straight from them their concerns, and I hope it's beneficial to them to hear from the tribes. So having both tiers of this communication, I think, are an important thing going forward.
Thank you. And Adrian, I'm just going to ask if, in addition to your comments and your closing, a few people have asked about how citizens can be involved in the process going forward to inform a good process. And if you could also touch on that in your closing.
Sure.
Yeah. Wrap it up.
So I agree with an open, transparent process based on sound science. And once Wisconsin DNR will start that process, there will be public hearings, meetings, opportunities, I'm sure, through the internet to comment on wolf management efforts, the proposed plans being considered. Eventually, any wolf plan by the Wisconsin DNR will have to be presented to the Natural Resource Board. Those are public hearings. The public has opportunity to attend those meetings. And there will be legislative review of that plan, and those would be also be public opportunities for public input. So there's a lot of different ways people can get involved. I think one of the things we want to be recognized is we also need to celebrate the success of wolf recovery in Wisconsin. We're talking about 1,000 wolves in a state that has almost 6,000 people, or 6 million people, has 1.5 million cows, and yet we've been able to support and maintain a healthy wolf population, which when I was growing up as a kid in the 1960s, I thought there was never a possibility we were going to have anything more than a handful of wolves back in the state, if at all possible. We thought there were wilderness species that were no longer going to exist in Wisconsin. We're finding we've got healthy wolf populations. The big issues will be the goals, and the biggest part of goals will be where wolves can live and how many we can have there. And we've found that 85% of our wolf packs don't cause livestock depredation problems, don't attack pet dogs. that most of our packs live in forested areas where they're benefiting the ecosystem. So I think an open, transparent process and encourage people to get involved to whatever extent they want to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adrian. This has been great, really informative, I think, for all of us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Perfect. Thanks, Fred. I'm just going to share my screen here to close us out today. We want to thank all of you for joining us. I know there are people calling in from all over the country, so thank you for being here and for listening in on our panel discussion. If you're interested in learning more and participating with Greenfire, how you can get involved, we urge you and suggest, recommend checking out our 2020 annual meeting, which is coming up in September. We have programs all throughout the month that will be taking place virtually given the COVID-19 pandemic. We are going to be discussing things that range from age, race, politics, and the future of conservation in Wisconsin. All of these programs are made free to you, although we have suggested donation if you do participate. We greatly appreciate that. And this is just a quick, kind of a busy slide, but a quick look at what we are offering. We're going to have an introduction that is kind of aimed towards young folks, but to anyone who is new to Greenfire and wanting to learn more about how they can engage. We also have a great discussion happening on September 16th with August Ball to discuss how we can advance racial equity and inclusion in conservation here in Wisconsin. Then we'll have a couple of conversations with former and current lawmakers, both on the 23rd and the 25th. We have a keynote with Russ Feingold on global conservation policy and science. And then we'd love if you stuck around and joined us for our 26th September 26th annual meeting sessions, where we'll have some really interesting breakout groups and a business meeting. And finally, we welcome your support and your contributions to making these great programs possible. And you can find out more about us again on Facebook, but also on our website at www.wigreenfire.org. Finally, we'd love to hear back from you about this event and your suggestions for future programs. Check your email in the next day or so. You'll be receiving a short survey to gather up your feedback. On behalf of all of us at Greenfire and the panel, thank you so much for attending, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.